In continuing our celebration of Black History Month, we're shedding light on prominent Black American authors who have contributed greatly to the American literary landscape and who have created works that have pronounced historical presence in American writing. In this video, we're going to be examining Ann Petry's The Street. The Street is a story that embodies the cultural dynamics of New York, the New York Harlem neighborhood. Ann Petry documents a lot of the tensions and trials and tribulations of Black Americans in the poor working class dynamic who struggle on a day-to-day basis with economic hardships, as well as the social challenges that surround their position in life from a racial standpoint alongside their white counterparts. Before we explore The Street and read some of its excerpts, we'll actually take some time to get a bit of background on Ann Petry as a writer. We're going to be looking at Ann Petry's biography as provided by Harvard Magazine and written by Farrah, Jasmine G. Unlike many aspiring artists who moved to New York, Ann Lane Petry did not come in search of celebrity or fame. She left her hometown of Old Saybrook, Connecticut for Harlem in 1938 to join her new husband, George, to escape the expectations of her middle-class family and to pursue her literary ambitions. Yet, in less than a decade, she would become the most successful Black woman writer of her day. The 1946 publication of her first novel, The Street, gained her widespread and ultimately unwanted attention as a writer and cultural figure. The youngest daughter of a pharmacist father and entrepreneurial mother, Petry was herself a professional pharmacist who began writing short stories while working in her father's store. When she abandoned the family business for New York, she quickly found work as a journalist. Her early years in Harlem were fueled by involvement in progressive political causes and membership in a community of activists, labor leaders, visual artists, actors, and writers. Despite working closely with self-identified communists, Petry never affiliated with the party and resisted efforts to enlist her as a fellow traveler. She maintained her distance and managed to be quite a loner in the midst of the city's crowd. Harlem inspired Petry. The legendary Black neighborhood provided the imagery, drama, incidents, and language for a body of work that included journalism, essays, and short stories, as well as the novel. Her fiction of the period features ordinary, law-abiding, working-class African-American protagonists. Most start off devoted to hard work and driven by middle-class aspirations with a strong belief in the American dream. But as they are thwarted at every turn by individual and institutional racism, and in the women's cases by violent sexism, they end up resigned, filled with despair, and often engaged in destructive, sometimes violent acts. And this description completely reflects the themes and the overall plot line of The Street, just in terms of how Black Americans have struggled and how they are often compromised because of the racial elements they face on a daily basis. Ludi Johnson, the protagonist of The Street, is a beautiful single mother who strives to leave domestic service for more lucrative employment. Her idea of success is inspired by Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, an Italian immigrant shopkeeper, and her wealthy white employers, all of whom encourage her to work, save money, and create a better life for her child in this best country in the world. But these mentors fail to warn her of the pitfalls and obstacles that await her as a working-class Black woman. She is under surveillance by a predatory neighbor, stalked by her building superintendent, and watched, cultivated, and trapped like prey by a white man who owns her apartment building as well as the club where she hopes to work. She has nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Street became the first novel by a Black American woman to sell more than 1 million copies. It was widely reviewed, published in several paperback editions, and translated into French, Spanish, Japanese, and Portuguese. Its author appeared on magazine covers and in a glossy feature article in Ebony magazine. But as her literary celebrity grew and as the specter of a second Red Scare began to rise, Petry and her husband returned to Old Saybrook in 1947, purchased a home, and avoided publicity except as it related directly to her writing. Some of this insistence on privacy no doubt came from a desire to protect herself. Her New York years had been filled with leftist friends and colleagues. She despised the anti-communist fervor that swept the nation in the 1950s and openly supported Paul Robeson, whose life and career it destroyed. Petry's third and most ambitious novel, The Narrows, published in 1953, set in a small Connecticut town, articulates her disdain for McCarthyism, which hunts both communists and Negroes. Yet, Petry's retreat from public life was also nurtured by her own sensibilities. She refused to reveal her personal life to reporters and scholars alike, believing that she had to choose between becoming a celebrity or a writer, concepts fundamentally incompatible in her mind. She described the hoopla that followed publication of The Street as turning her into a public property. Time and again, the phrase pops up in her personal papers, in conversations revealed by her only child, Elizabeth. As late as 1996, a half-century after the novel appeared, she told a radio interviewer, "Continuous public exposure, though it may make you a personality, can diminish you as a person. To be a willing accomplice to the invasion of your own privacy puts a low price on its worth. The creative processes are or should be essentially secret, and although naked flesh is now an open commodity, the naked spirit should have sanctuary." She so feared the possibility of exposure that she destroyed much of her own writing, including letters generations of Black New Englanders, many of them property and business owners. Petry could have seen property ownership as the only avenue to ensure independence and autonomy. She had lived, after all, in a Harlem populated and energized by Black people, but not owned by them. For Petry, self-ownership, including the right to privacy, was a priority of those, like Black people and women, who had legally been the property of others. Self-ownership was a personal, political, even a spiritual necessity. It was an effort to reclaim herself, to reserve space for the creation of her work, and an effort to ensure that the work be valued and judged on its own terms. Very interesting. So as we can see, Ann Petry had a lot of strong opinions about the Black experience. She asserted herself in terms of her demand of her privacy. She was not necessarily interested or embracing of the celebrity status that she achieved, being, I guess, the first Black woman, renowned Black female or Black woman author, Black woman writer, to sell over 1 million copies and to have had achieved such immense success as a result of her writing. So she seems to be a very intriguing individual. I find it very interesting that she had ties to the Communist Party, which makes sense because being a writer, being an author of that time period, communism and socialism pretty much on the rise, especially in New York. A lot of Black people gravitated towards communist notions or communist ideas or socialist ideas because it offered an inclusive attribute with a premise on equality and every person being seen according to their own value and being treated equally, as opposed to class distinctions and race distinctions, at least in principle. So again, many Black people did gravitate toward those philosophies, even if they didn't necessarily join the Communist Party. So now that we have a bit of background on Ann Petry in terms of her journey towards becoming a writer, let's get into some excerpts of The Streets, an amazing book. I feel like I say the same thing about all of the Black writers that I'm covering in this series, but The Street, if you haven't read it, to learn how widely popular The Street was and how much notoriety she experienced as a result of publishing this particular novel, I think is really amazing. I think that her name is definitely on par with the literary canon, right? The Faulkners and the Hawthornes, all of these individuals who dominate the literary schema of American history. But Ann Petry is a dope writer. Many of you may not have even heard of The Street. I hadn't heard of it until I went to college. And again, it's a fantastic book. The literary realism is so pronounced. I think many of you will enjoy it. So without further ado, let's get into Ann Petry's The Street. Hi there again. So we're going to read a few excerpts from this fantastic novel. What can I say about The Street and what can I say about Ann Petry's writing? It's almost like I have a love affair with these writers. Now, The Street is, again, a work of literary realism. Ann Petry depicts a young woman, Luddy Johnson. Is it Luddy or Ludi Johnson? I don't know. I don't remember how we pronounce it in class. I'm going to say Luddy, and if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. Ludi is this beautiful young African-American woman. Everyone that lays eyes on her, kind of marvels at her beauty. So the story is supposed to be an overall presentation of how we oftentimes find ourselves swimming upstream because of the perils that we endure in life. And of course, in Ann Petry's work, she captures the racial overtones of an individual's experience, particularly the African American experience, of course. The story is sort of a narrative that just explores how, the American dream is not the same for everyone. And I mean, that's a running trope in so many works of literature. Like, is the American dream the American dream? Is the American dream accessible to all? How does the American dream look to people of different colors, of different genders, of different backgrounds, etc., etc.? The American dream is supposed to be this notion that everyone has an equal chance of succeeding if they work hard and if they maintain the right values and if they save and if they have the right attitude and the right sentiments towards life. But of course, the American dream is heavily nuanced because in Luddy Johnson's case, as a young black woman married to an African American man, we get a glimpse into how the American dream is not such a cookie cutter way to success, and how it's heavily compromised and heavily distorted in terms of what the challenges and the difficulties that black men and black women have to face as they navigate their way to success. So Luddy Johnson ends up finding herself in all of these economic trials and all of these complicated situations that create obstacles over and over again as she tries to achieve this dream, right? For herself, for her son, for her family. I mean, I don't want to give the entire story away, but as a result, somewhere along the lines of the story, she ends up a single mother, right? Her husband, the circumstances he endures with his job and his employment makes things difficult for them to maintain a house, right? The American dream again, the white picket fence house with the 2.5 kids. From the very beginning, they encounter these overwhelming challenges that we can see obstruct their way to success and to achieving the dream. Somewhere along the lines, Luddy ends up a single mother, responsible for her son by herself. She ends up moving to Harlem, to a really small, cramped apartment in Harlem. And the imagery in the story, and again, the storytelling attributes, it's so easy for you to see these pictures and these illustrations of Black American life in 1930s, or is it 1940s? I believe 1940s Harlem, which is the setting of the story, right? Somewhere around World War II, that particular time. So Luddy ends up in this very small Harlem apartment as a single mother. She has her son goes to school. He's what we would regard as a latchkey kid. So he's pretty much left to suffice for himself in many regards because Luddy is a working woman. She has to pay her rent. She's trying to save money so she could eventually get out of this apartment and get into a better neighborhood and get her son into a better school. And this dream is it's almost like she's chasing her tail. This dream is ahead of her. She's steady trying to grasp it, but so many pitfalls along the way present themselves. Luddy finds herself in these weird situations. She experiences sexual harassment, lack of accessibility to sufficient income. She works as a secretary at some point, but it's not enough, obviously. There is a point in time in the beginning of the story where she does get a job working for an upper middle class white family as a nanny or as a housekeeper or something like that. And then, she ends up working as a secretary, and she's still steadily trying to gain more income to, again, save money and to be able to build her way up to a more economically stable lifestyle. She encounters really, really, really dark circumstances along the way. She encounters a lot of really bad people, issues with her son in terms of the safety of her son going to school by himself every day. He then has his own challenges with neighborhood bullies. And as we're, gaining insight into Luddy Johnson's journey, we're also getting a picture, or we're also getting an overall account of the lives and the experiences of other African American individuals in the story. Situations involving the landlord of her building, the superintendent of her building. There's situations involving this guy, I forget his name, but he's like this big shot who has access to all of these opportunities, and like he has a major Jones for Letty Johnson. Letty is not interested in him in that way. And then we get an account of how she has to fight against the advances of men that she doesn't care to be involved with, as well as, you know, the difficulties that she has with attaining sufficient income and employment, and how every little thing threatens her journey or her path to success. And the story doesn't have a happy ending, and I'm not going to give the ending away, but it's definitely an intriguing read. I heavily encourage you to read this book. It chronicles so much of the realities that people deal with on a day-to-day basis. The story is very centered on, you know, a literary realism style of writing. And it's almost like you're there. And it's not an over-exaggeration or an embellishment of our circumstances. Like, it's very authentic. It feels authentic. It feels like, hey, even in today's day and age, you very much get that sensation that these things are still real and still penetrating our everyday scenarios in life. I guarantee that you like it. It's not as small as Passing Now. It's a thick one, all right? It's a heavy one for sure, but it's a good read, and you'll enjoy it, and you'll be so enwrapped in it that you won't even notice, because you won't even want the story to end. There are so many twists and turns, a roller coaster of events taking place throughout its pages that'll keep you engaged and keep you on the edge of your seats. So pick it up. Something in my eyes, and with a golden ticket. Okay, it feels so good to sit down. The last time I read Standing Up, and that was like, oh. Chapter 1. There was a cold November wind blowing through 116th Street. It rattled the tops of garbage cans, sucked window shades out through the top of open windows and set them flapping back against the windows, and it drove most of the people off the street in the block between 7th and 8th Avenues, except for a few hurried pedestrians who bent to double in an effort to offer the least possible exposed surface to its violent assaults. It found every scrap of paper along the street, theater throwaways, announcements of dances and lodge meetings, the heavy wax paper that loaves of bread had been wrapped in, the thinner wax paper that had enclosed sandwiches, old envelopes, newspapers. She's already setting the scene for some cold and intense things to take place. Petry is painting a picture. And I'm from New York myself, okay? And I've been to Harlem plenty of times, and I've been to, you know, all over the city. I feel like I'm in Harlem right now. Shout out to 7th and 8th Avenues, right? The A and C train line. The A is the express and the C is the local. Fingering its way along the curb, the wind set the bits of paper to dancing high in the air, so that a barrage of paper swirled into the faces of the people on the street. It even took time to rush into doorways and areaways and find chicken bones and pork chop bones and push them along the curb. The wind is its own personality, the wind is its own entity, and the wind seems to have a presence, a human-like presence, a character-like presence in the story so far. It did everything it could to discourage the people walking along the street. It found all the dirt and dust and grime on the sidewalk and lifted it up so that the dirt got into their noses, making it difficult to breathe. The dust got into their eyes and blinded them, and the grit stung their skins. It wrapped newspaper around their feet, entangling them until the people cursed deep in their throats, stamped their feet, kicked at the paper. The wind blew it back again and again until they were forced to stoop and dislodge the paper with their hands. And then the wind grabbed their hats, pried their scarves from around their necks, stuck its fingers inside their coat collars, blew their coats away from their bodies. Beautiful. The wind lifted Letty Johnson's hair away from the back of her neck so that she felt suddenly naked and bald, for her hair had been resting softly and warmly against her skin. She shivered as the cold fingers of the wind touched the back of her neck, explored the sides of her head. It even blew her eyelashes away from her eyes so that her eyeballs were bathed in a rush of coldness, and she had to blink in order to read the words on the signs swaying back and forth over her head. So in comes Letty Johnson as our protagonist. Each time she thought she had the sign in focus, the wind pushed it away from her so that she wasn't certain whether it said 3 rooms or 2 rooms. If it was 3, why, she would go in and ask to see it, but if it said 2, why, there wasn't any point. Even with the wind twisting the sign away from her, she could see that it had been there for a long time because its original coat of white paint was streaked with rust where years of rain and snow had finally eaten the paint off, down to the metal, and the metal had slowly rusted, making a dark red stain like blood. So we're already getting a very dark description of the atmosphere of the setting, a very kind of gloomy, dark description of the setting. It was 3 rooms. The wind held it for an instant in front of her, then swooped it away until it was standing at an impossible angle on the rod and suspended it from the building. She read it rapidly. 3 rooms, steam heat, parquet floors, respectable tenants, reasonable. She looked at the outside of the building. Now, this is where Petry shows off. Right? This is where Petry goes in as an author. She looked at the outside of the building. Parquet floors here meant that the wood was old and so discolored no amount of varnish or shellac would conceal the scars in the old scraped places, the years of dragging furniture across the floors, the hammer blows of time, and children and drunks and dirty, slovenly women. Steam heat meant a rattling, clanging noise in radiators early in the morning, and then a hissing that went on. I am laughing as I'm reading this because if any New Yorkers are in here right now listening to me read this excerpt, you are, especially New Yorkers who are from the city, from the boroughs, particularly Brooklyn, Manhattan, Uptown, whatever, right? Maybe some areas of Queens. Y'all are right. This goes on today. I mean, again, 1940s. This goes on today. At those heaters that make the clanking noise, the loud pound clanking until the room gets hot, right? And then it hisses because it's letting out steam. That goes on today at those old-fashioned type of radiators, the parquet floors. You may still see parquet floors. I feel like when you look at renovated apartment buildings, they still use that type of wood, to create those parquet floors. Respectable tenants in these houses where colored people were allowed to live included anyone who could pay the rent, so some of them would be drunk and loudmouth and quarrelsome, given to fits of depression when they would curse and cry violently, given to fits of equally violent elation. And she thought because the walls would be flimsy, why, the good people, the bad people, the children, the dogs, and the god-awful smells would all be wrapped up together in one big package, the package that was called Respectable Tenants. See, guys, I don't be lying to you. I told you it was a dope book. Let's read a little bit more and then I'll let you go. The wind pried at the red skull cap on her head, and as though angered because it couldn't tear it loose from its firm anchorage of bobby pins, the wind blew a great cloud of dust and ashes and bits of paper into her face, her eyes, her nose. It smacked against her ears as though it were giving her a final, exacerbated blow as proof of its displeasure in not being able to make her move on. Wow, so it's almost like the wind is trying to detour her away from that sign and away from that building, as if the wind knows, as if the wind already knew that something sinister lies behind those walls. Letty braced her body against the wind's attack, determined to finish thinking about the apartment before she went in to look at it. Reasonable. Now that could mean almost anything. On 8th Avenue, it meant tenements, ghastly places not fit for humans. On St. Nicholas Avenue, it meant high rents for small apartments. And on 7th Avenue, it meant great big apartments where you had to take in roomers in order to pay the rent. On this street, it could mean almost anything. See how she keeps bringing in the street, which is the title of the, okay, I'm being silly, sorry. She turned and faced the wind in order to estimate the street. The buildings were old with small, slit-like windows, which meant the rooms were small and dark. In a street running in this direction, there wouldn't be any sunlight in the apartments. Not ever. It would be hot as hell in summer and cold in winter. Reasonable here in this dark, crowded street ought to be about $28, provided it was on a top floor. Wow, $28 a month. You know when your grandparents and your great-grandparents be telling you about the good old days when, a piece of candy cost half a penny? $28 a month. Well, let me sound like one of them grandmamas right now, because for those of you, well, I guess I would be considered a millennial. So for those of you Gen Zers or whatever the generation under the millennials are called, how about I remember the good old days when the average rent in the city was $800. And I'm not talking rent stabilized, rent control. I'm talking about market value rents in downtown Brooklyn, even in some places, $800, no more than $1,000. Now you can't find anything for less than $2,000, okay? Hallways here would be dark and narrow. Then she shrugged her shoulders, forgetting an apartment where she and Bub would be alone was more important than dark hallways. The thing that really mattered was getting away from Pop and his rattled women, and anything was better than that. Dark hallways, dirty stairs, even roaches on the walls. Anything, anything, anything. Anything? Well, almost anything. So she turned toward the entrance of the building, and as she turned, she heard someone clear his or her throat. It was so distinct, done as it was on two notes, the first one high and then the grunting expiration of breath on the lower notes. Petry's dope. That it came to her ears quite clearly under the sound of the wind rattling the garbage cans and slapping at the curtains. It was as though someone had said hello, and she looked up at the window over her head. There was a faint light somewhere in the room she was looking into, and the enormous bulk of a woman was silhouetted against the light. She half closed her eyes in order to see better. The woman was very black. She had a bandana knotted tightly around her head, and Letty saw with some surprise that the window was open. She began to wonder how the woman could sit by an open window on a cold, windy night like this one. And she didn't have on a coat, but a kind of loose-looking cotton dress, or at least it must be cotton, she thought, for it had a clumsy look, bulky and wrinkled. Nice little place, dearie. Just ring the super spell and he'll show it to you. The woman's voice was rich, pleasant, yet the longer Letty looked at her, the less she liked her. It wasn't that the woman had been sitting there all along staring at her, reading her thoughts, pushing her way into her very mind, for that was merely annoying, but it was understandable. She probably didn't have anything else to do. Perhaps she was sick, and the only pleasure she got out of life wasn't watching what went on in the street outside of her window. It wasn't that. It was the woman's eyes. They were as still and as malignant as the eyes of a snake. She could see them quite plainly, flat eyes that stared at her, wandering over her body, inspecting and appraising her from head to foot. Just ring the super bells, dearie, the woman repeated. Letty turned toward the entrance of the building without answering, thinking about the woman's eyes. She pushed the door open and walked inside and stood there nodding her head. The hall was dark. The low wattage bulb in the ceiling shed just enough light so that you wouldn't actually fall over. Well, a piano that someone had carelessly left at the foot of the stairs so that you could see the outlines of, oh, possibly an elephant if it were dragged in from the street by some enterprising tenants. However, if you dropped a penny, she thought, you'd have to get down on your hands and knees and scrabble around on the cracked tile floor before you could ever hope to find it. And she was wrong about the being able to see an elephant or a piano because the hallway really wasn't wide enough to admit either one. The stairs went up steeply, dark, high, narrow steps. She stared at them fascinated. Going upstairs like those, you ought to find a newer and more intricate, a much involved and perfected kind of hell at the top, the very top. So I'm going to stop here, and I want you guys to tell me what you think. I think it's a really, really good start to what turns out to be a fascinating read. Ann Petry is a really, really creative and detailed and thorough writer. And if you do get a chance to read it, come back and let me know how it was or how you enjoyed it. And if you happen to have already read The Street, shout it out in the comments. Tell me what you liked about it. Tell me if you enjoyed it. Tell me if you think maybe it was too long. I think the length was perfect because for me it was a page turner. Again, in celebration of Black History Month, celebrating Black writers, especially Black women writers, and Petry's The Street. Peace.